It'll absorb all the water. Now, once that sponge is completely wet, if you pick it up, you'll notice, wow, it's much heavier than it was. Why? Because it now has the weight of the water incorporated into its matrix. The same principle, or same types of things happens with clay soils. They have an affinity for water. They want water. So when there's water, landscaping water, rain, what they'll do is they'll grab onto that water, okay, and they'll absorb it. And when they do, what happens? Well, water is a particle. They'll actually expand, just like that kitchen sponge. And what happens is they start to expand. They can actually lift up structures that are around them or near them. And sometimes you'll see in certain parts of very clay areas. I know Torrance has some clay areas. Down in South Orange County, we have very expansive clays. They will actually lift up sidewalks. They can actually lift up houses as they collect all that water. Now, the same things. If you dry out that same sponge, say you would put it back in my college apartment and put it on the sink, it wouldn't get used for a few weeks. All the water would start to evaporate and dry out. And what happens? The sponge would shrink. Same thing with soils. If the water is allowed to evaporate or dry out, that soil is going to contract and shrink. And that movement, that fluctuation is not very good for things that are on top of it, because that up and down movement is what ends up causing buildings oftentimes to crack, because they're not built to be flexible like that. So again, and what happens with these clay soils is, as for settlement, actually that's my analogy. Now let's take that wet sponge that we have on our counter. Now what happens if I was to apply pressure onto that wet sponge? What's going to happen? The water, you physically see the water start coming out of the side of the sponge, and the sponge is going to get more narrow as I apply pressure. Again, the same thing with clay soils. As you put a new building load or a new load on them, what happens is they can no longer hold on to the water that they've absorbed. Why? Because they have this new load that's on top of them. So as they get pushed down, they have to let go of the water. And as they let go of that water, their matrix essentially gets smaller, and they will end up settling. And again, how long that takes is how strong the soil's affinity is to hold on to that water. If it's very strong, it could take years sometimes for the clays to actually settle out. And also, of course, it's dependent on the building load. So what happens with these settlements? Well, there's different types of settlements. If we have a deep fill, a deep canyon fill, we'll oftentimes experience what's called differential settlement or uniform settlement. Now, another analogy for settlement is kind of like cholesterol. We all have cholesterol. There's kind of good cholesterol and there's bad cholesterol. Uniform settlement is kind of like good cholesterol. Why? Everything around you is settling. If you have a house here in the middle of this canyon, it starts to settle. You might really not notice. Why? Well, because the streets are settling with you. All the utilities are settling. Everything around you is settling. A good example is Long Beach. The downtown Long Beach, or the Long Beach area in the marina, that area has settled feet. I can't remember with the exact numbers, but due to the dewatering and the pumping, that whole area has settled. Well, have they noticed, like the one neighbor in this next one, hey, my house is settling? No, because everything's going so uniformly, and it's such a widespread area, people don't really notice. However, if you happen to be on one of these, on the edges, where maybe you have part of your house here on this bedrock or firmer materials, and then part of it on these fills that are settling, then you're going to experience what's called differential settlement, okay? And that's going to be oftentimes bad. Why? Because as these materials settle, buildings, like I said, if buildings are not really designed to take a lot of movement or move up and down and flex a lot, you'll start to see cracks, you'll start to see distress, and there's issues that happen with differential settlement. So differential settlement is bad settlement. It's kind of like bad cholesterol. How do we tell if a building is settling, is moving? Well, oftentimes what we'll do is, because oftentimes you can't really tell from just looking at a building, is that at a level? I don't know. I guess you have a really good eye for that, you might be able to tell. But one thing that we usually do is we'll go and we'll do what's called a manometer or a floor level survey. And essentially, this is this instrument here. It's a pretty simple instrument. And what we do is we have this water bath, essentially. This is open to the atmosphere, okay? Connected to this water bath is this tube. It's a flexible tube, and there's water in this tube, and it reconnects to this calibrated, open-ended rod. So the water level in this rod is always going to end up being the same water level in this reservoir. So then what essentially we do is I take this around, if you'll notice, as I lift this, here's the water level for those of you that might not be able to see it. As I lift this rod up, the water level is going to come back down and eventually come to the equilibrium point, high enough, where again it's at that same level as the reservoir. And if I move it down, again it's going to come back up. So what we do with the manometer survey is we simply will walk around a room. If I was going to do this upstairs floor here, I go around, maybe start in the corner and just take a reading, you know, on an interval in a grid throughout this whole building. They don't have points. This is going to tell me, you know, 8.6, 8.5, 8.2 as I move around this building. Then when I get back to the office, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all this grid with all these points, and I'm going to contour it. I'm going to take all the points that are about the same level, the lowest point, and I'm going to draw a line around them. And then, say a half an inch above, I'm going to connect all the dots. It's kind of like being in elementary school again, but I get paid to do this, so you know I get to connect all these points. And then what I end up with is contour. And what you can kind of see here, this is a residence that it has settled. Here's like this showing here. There's 4 inches is a high point. The low point in the back corner of the building is 0. So this across this residence has had 4 inches of settlement. Okay. If you've had a typical house that maybe experienced 4 inches of settlement, you'll probably see a lot of cracks in the house. You'll see cracks in the drywall, oftentimes at the intersections at windows, at doorways. Doors aren't, you know, assuming they haven't fixed it, they haven't done cosmetic repairs or repairs to this. You can definitely see it. Also, a 4 to 5 inch differential. You'll probably feel it in the floor as you're walking. Like, wow, it feels like this, like I'm kind of going down, like I'm in a theater or something. I'm sloping down. You can actually feel a few inches of differential. Again, partly depends how big the house is. What we're looking for typically is a pretty level house. Here you can see 0 to 0.5. This house is generally level. Most houses are built level, and if the soils haven't moved it around, it probably will still be level. But homes usually aren't built with a big tilt in them, and if they are, that probably means that the soils moved around them, or below them, I should say.
Is there a measurement that you can't feel, like an inch or two?
Yeah, inches. Yeah, an inch or two. Again, it depends. What we're actually looking at is the differential across a distance as well. Oftentimes, we like to see a 1 inch over, about 1 inch over 20 feet or so. That's probably within typical slab on grade construction tolerance. If you're less than that, maybe 1 inch over 5 feet or 10 feet, that's when it gets a little bit too out of level, that there's probably something that's happened to this building since it was originally constructed. Another type of settlement is collapsible soils. We have a little bit of these soils here, not too bad, but essentially what happens with these soils were typically deposited in a very dry area. They're looking, again, they're constructed so that the individual particles, again, have this point-to-point contact. So they're kind of held up, they're holding each other up. Now what happens is as water comes in to these areas and essentially lubricates these individual soil particles, with or without a new load, with or without a new load, what happens is these particles are going to want to settle in. So if you were to actually take your knuckles, another little analogy I have, and you put your knuckles point to point, and you're to press down, you know, there's a point where you can, oh, look, I can keep my knuckles together. If I press hard enough, my knuckles are going to want to slide into a more equalized position, right? They don't want to stay at that point-to-point contact. Now, if I was to put water on my hands or put lotion on my hands, I try to do the same experiment, it's going to take a lot less pressure for my knuckles to slide into place. Similar thing happens with soils. As soils get wet and become lubricated, they oftentimes can end up settling. Example of that, this is actually in Nevada. Nevada has a lot of collapsible soils. This is a house that actually was built on some collapsible soils. There were some ground fissures. There was, of course, a water main break across the street, and it ended up having some serious settlement issues. Here you can see this is the actual foundation of the house. The framing is actually holding up the house. So this framer did a great job. Oftentimes the framers get blamed for a lot of things, but this guy did a really good job. Okay, so he's still holding up the house. Here's what the inside of that house looked like. Again, like as I mentioned, if you see a house with a lot of settlement, you'll typically start to see cracks. You know, again, near the ceiling, anytime walls or joints come together. Here's that additional air conditioning that they have in this house, bottom of the floor there. Here's, again, someone looking at the outside near the windows. Again, anytime there's any openings in the structure is typically where the cracks are going to propagate from initially, first. And again, we're seeing that here. Here's the floor level survey of the residence, just to give you an idea. This is that low point. This is that bay window area. There was about, let's say, I can't remember, 12 or 13 inches of settlement across this house, and in the garage as well. This is the garage opening. And typically garages, if you were to do a floor level survey in a garage, most garage slabs are sloped to the opening. And the reason is it